Well, good evening, everybody. What my colleague Willie has told you, I won't repeat other than to say that we won't be looking at tachyons or those fast particles that in fact physicists study. But nevertheless, at least I can claim that all the chemicals I'm dealing with are realities. They are realities in the sense that, in fact, we are all exposed to them, certainly in the Western world, because admittedly, most of them are associated, in fact, with, I suppose, the Industrial Revolution and what followed on, the biotechnology revolution, as an example, the current one. And as you'll see in a minute, I decided to leave off the first few slides. As Willie has said, you might think biochemistry was not toxicology, but of course toxicology is not a subject. Toxicology is the science of the study of poisons, to put it in its old terminology. But biochemistry, physiology and pharmacology, and chemistry of course, are the subjects which constitute the subject itself, a derived subject, toxicology. To my knowledge, there is no undergraduate course in any Irish university in toxicology. It's regarded as a postgraduate course. My own specialism in it is in anaesthetics, actually, and Willie has referred to it, in that we were interested in how anaesthetics, which are gases, of course, most of us developed in the hospitals in Ireland. They give about maybe up to 1 million anaesthetics a year, as an example. And some very new anaesthetics came on the market when I was a young fellow, and we were studying them ever since. And we did discover the gene for the susceptibility, and if you're unfortunate enough to have the gene, half of your kids will also have the gene. It's quite a shall we say, difficult disease to treat, but we can now diagnose it by a DNA test, or initially we can do a simpler test. Now, just to get back to consumer products, I don't know whether we call anaesthetics consumer products, but certainly the way things are going, students are being called consumers. So why not call anaesthetics consumers? Isn't that true? Yeah. Or at least the patients who get them are consumers. And I just took that title because it's a fairly broad title, really, and you'll see that I cover a wide range of topics. So, I said we just look first at problems in this area. Certainly the BSc scandal was a farming scandal, not by the farmers so much. We had the SARS crisis. We had, at one stage, you were afraid to travel to Australia if you were, say, older than about 50 because of the probability of deep vein thrombosis. Well, people who fly in aircraft are consumers. Brain cancer from mobile phones. I don't think we need worry too much about it. So I'm just making points about them without commenting on the severity of their health effects. If you look at air pollution, well, if you were to heed some of the media, you'd wonder why we were all alive. I'm not making any apologies for the fact that air pollution, of course, has gone on in certain cases. Household chemicals and plastics, we are very familiar with lots of them. But I think that if we come to the next one, fats and obesity, that's why I said my title was rather broad, and perhaps you might have thought we would put this under consumer products. But of course, when we buy meat, when we buy various foods, isn't that right? We are actually buying fats, and of course, fats have contributed to obesity. And outside of the United States, Europe has the highest rate of obesity at the moment. 2/3 of the people in the States have some form of obesity. 1/3, therefore, have a normal body weight and fat level. And we're not far behind in Europe, and certainly in this country. And the last one, the crisis in 2008 in Ireland with the dioxin exposure via pork. That occurred in, I think, December the 6th, 2008. And in Germany as well. Now, I'll be commenting on them later. We won't say any more about those. But they were all big problems, and they fall into the realm of the heading that I had there. Now, many of you will recognize this one. This is, of course, the poor old Socrates getting hemlock for misperformance or misdeeds in Athens, about around 300 BC. And the reason for putting it on is it may not be the clearest, but in fact, when I enlarged in my computer, you could actually see that he was drinking the hemlock there. This was the first state order execution, and the executioning medium was hemlock. So, there's toxicology for you in very early times. The state of Athens seemed to know something about it. I don't think they knew how hemlock worked, and they had certainly no antidote if they were going to consider reviving it. Now, back to the real chemicals. I said that, look, we can't cover all chemicals. It is reckoned there are 100,000 chemicals on the market at any one time in the West. But of course, chemically speaking, there are probably 12 million chemicals known. Now, they will be both synthetic and naturally occurring chemicals that have been purified in laboratories. But only 100,000 are on the market, approximately, at any one time. And so, by just taking that's 3, 5, 8, 9, I have one or two more. There are, say, about 12 chemicals altogether that, for me, are good examples of the problems that we experience when we, shall we say, complain about chemicals. Many of you will have heard maybe of melamine. I'll be dealing with it now in more detail. It occurs in baby food. It is a protein substitute which causes, shall we say, some kidney problems. Diethylene glycol in toothpaste. Chromium. Everybody in Cork knows about chromium from Paul Bolan. No, I'm not saying it's that big a problem, but I'm certainly going to comment on it. Mercury, dioxins, bisphenol A, acrylamide, formaldehyde, styrene, and I have Sudan 3 as well, and one or two others. So that's just telling you what I want to more or less cover. Now, I'm going to show that, in fact, many of the problems that we have are due to a deficiency of regulation of chemicals in the environment. In 2007, the EU brought in a new program called REACH, which I've explained 2/3 of the way in the lecture, to try and, as it were, regulate things better. It reminds me of the banking crisis. It hasn't quite reached the severity of the banking crisis, but certainly the analogy is, I think, a strong one. Now, in the media, and I'm not talking about just newspapers, I'm talking about television programs, including the 5 o'clock program on RTE and BBC programs, and Prime Time and others. They misuse the word toxic all the time, virtually. And the statement that I have actually put in blue on top is the Paracelsus Principle. He was a physician-scientist, admittedly from the Renaissance times. He was German-Swiss in origin. And he, in fact, established that all substances are poisons. There is none that is not a poison. The right dose differentiates a poison from a remedy. So we've known that since about 1540, approximately, during the Renaissance. Yet, what's that telling us? It tells us all substances are poisonous. That means water is poisonous. And I do have a record of a number of people who actually killed themselves with water, and not from drowning either, by the way. And that's often not believed. Now, that's why I said the media are wrong. It is incorrect to state that chemicals are toxic, qualifying the word toxic. It's the dose that determines, in my own words, it's the dose that determines whether a chemical is toxic or not. It's the dose that differentiates the poison from the remedy. And hence headlines in the newspapers. They had one recently, by the way, in a very reputable international journal, Nature. They called it the toxic truth of sugar. Absolute rubbish, in fact, from a toxicological standpoint. You have to, in fact, use the adjectives very, very carefully when, in fact, you use these ones. So if you think of that one, when you look in future at what's on the side of the tin of peas or the bottle of fake tan or whatever, I was going to bring a few along tonight, but decided I'd leave them. But always remember that what's written in the press is to sell papers, and maybe we should charge you more for the television license through some government minister or other. But a new idea also crept in, but not to the 20th century actually, to the end of the 20th century. And that is the idea of there being a no observed adverse effect level for chemicals. So, what you do with chemicals is when you look at them, you try and see what highest dose is there that doesn't cause any adverse effect. It's unfortunate animals are used at the present time, although they can accidentally be shown in humans too in exposures. So we abbreviate this term, the NOAA, this thing here. And it will be important in a moment, in fact, to explain this more. But just to explain now the terms that are used in this area before I go on. You have acute toxicity. That's measured in a very short period of time, over 24 hours. So some chemicals have acute toxicity. Cyanide would be an example. Were you to take cyanide, I can tell you you'd experience it within a few minutes, by the way. But certainly to be all over in 24 hours. Subchronic toxicity is something that is measured over 1 to 90 days, and then chronic toxicity is long-term. Usually in animals, when it's tested, it's 2/3 of the lifespan, because you cannot obviously continue studies indefinitely. And they have agreed 2/3 is the most useful period of a lifespan. The test species are various rodents: rat, mouse, hamster, guinea pig. Not so much the rabbit and dog anymore. Now, you'll note that this is what was done in the past. And this is often referred to as in vivo testing. In vivo testing, I don't personally approve of myself. And although I'm not as active as I used to be doing testing or anything like that, we were, for the last 20 years, we have been testing chemicals using cells that are cultured in the lab. In fact, there are many lines, that is tissue types, of human cells that you can test out in the lab. And amazingly enough, the Americans are all going that way now, and so is the REACH program in Europe, with the ultimate objective of eliminating animals completely from testing, which would be, I think, a good thing. But there are difficulties in extrapolating from isolated cells up to people the size of human beings, as an example. But just remember those terms: acute, short term, this is medium term, and this is long term. So cancer studies would be long term, immunological studies would be long term. And at the very bottom, all toxicity data must be extrapolated to the human situation. So that's where there's some uncertainty, in fact, in the whole thing. Now, this is the thing you'll often see about toxicity. And when we look at compounds like alcohol, this is ordinary alcohol, salt, ferrous sulfate that's added to bread at times, morphine, this was an anaesthetic, DDT, strychnine, nicotine, cigarettes. This is a muscle relaxant used as a narrow poison in South America as well. Dioxin is here. This is the famous chemical from incineration, supposedly. And tetrodotoxin is from the pufferfish in Japan. If you've been to Japan for holidays and you go to a restaurant and they don't take the liver out of the pufferfish, you'll certainly be in hospital in the evening. It's not a doubt. This is one of the most powerful chemicals, toxic chemicals known, and neurotoxin. But the most toxic chemical known, and maybe some of you know it, is of course Clostridium botulinum toxin. It's a protein. And this is where the papers always get it wrong. They always say the most toxic chemical known is this one. Absolutely wrong. Okay. I can assure you, absolutely wrong. It's also species dependent as well. This is the most toxic chemical known. So if you put your meat in the fridge and don't take the plastic covering off it and you leave it too long, the bacteria, the Clostridium, they actually grow under anaerobic, i.e. oxygen-free conditions. So you're supposed to take the film off meat, isn't that right, when you put it in the fridge? Okay? People don't appreciate then that it's a natural chemical that's the most toxic one. This is a synthetic chemical. So it is not true that synthetic chemicals are always worse than natural chemicals, as I'll prove later on as well. Now, what have I shown here? I'm going to hit myself. On the right-hand side is a measure of toxicity. But the LD50 is a term many of you I'm sure have heard when they talk about toxicity. It's the dose of a chemical that kills 50% of exposed animals. So if you had 100 animals divided into groups of 10, that would be 10 groups, you then would test out different doses and you'd see what dose killed 50% of the animals overnight, 24 hours. And this measure is what you have here then. Alcohol, this is 10,000 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. This would correspond to 10 grams, by the way, per kilogram of body weight. And you can ask me questions if you want on this one. I don't want to spend too much time at it. but it does show you the relative toxicity of chemicals. So it takes 10 grams of alcohol to kill the animals, per kilogram that is, 4 grams of sodium chloride, salt, 1.5 grams of ferrous sulfate, that's iron sulfate, DDT, that would be 0.1 gram per kilogram, and dioxin here, 0.2 of a, that's 200 micrograms, 200 millionths of gram per kilogram. So it is more toxic, okay. Tetrodotoxin is 100 micrograms, and botulinum toxin is, in fact, is 10 billionths of gram, actually, per kilogram. So you can see it has 1, 2, 3 more noughts in it on the case of tetrodotoxin. 1, 2, 3. This only tells you relative toxicity. How would you like if I got a new drug and told you the LD50 was 5 milligrams per kilogram? All that was telling you was how lethal the chemical was. It wasn't telling you what dose was it safe at. And if you remember the NOAL that I showed on my third slide, that does tell you. But we don't always have that data at the present time. So LD50, the lethal dose that kills 50% of animals. Now, you can work out yourself too from this how many pints of Guinness that you would need, or Heineken, on the basis that it's 4 grams, as you know, 4%, 4 grams per 100 mils. You can work out. And were you to drink 28 pints over a period of about 2 hours, allowing for a certain level of dehydration, rather than slugging it all down, you certainly would be in a very severe coma with a blood alcohol of about 750 milligrams per 100 mils. Now the limit at the moment is 50 milligrams per 100 mils, as you know, under the new regulations. It was always reputed that Brendan Behan, the famous playwright, could actually beat the UCD students. Willie would vouch for this. In fact, in Earlsfort Terrace in Dublin, because he used to drink, I'm not sure about 28, but certainly he went over 20 pints in 3 hours. Very dangerous chemical. Yet we, in fact, all have it every day. I said I'd mention about carcinogen classification as well. So this is basic toxicology, you would say, first. And there are 2 systems, really, that are well recognized. There is an EU system as well, but I'm not going to deal with it because it is new and not better than these 2 systems. And this is the World Health Organization system here, and this is the United States Environmental Protection Agency system, because the US EPA is the body that, in fact, regulates these things in the States. Our EPA does not do this. We have definite human carcinogens. They're called Group 1 in the WHO and A in the US EPA system. Probables, possibles, and limited evidence, and then no evidence, 4. So if I said a chemical was grade 4, or group 4, whichever you want to call it, it would mean it was a chemical for which, in fact, it had been studied and in laboratories, and it was shown that it did not cause cancer at all, within the normal levels of uncertainty in scientific experiments. And remember, you can never get 100% certainty. It's always some figure somewhat less than 100, depending on the techniques or the measurement techniques you're using. But the ones that often cause problems are these ones here. What's a probable human carcinogen? A carcinogen being a substance which causes some type of the up to 200 types of cancer that are known to exist. Well, this means, in fact, that this has definitely been shown. I'll give you an example. Benzene and chromium are in that category. I think there are about 70 or 80 chemicals in that category at the moment. Probable ones, formaldehyde is actually one. Some of the cigarette chemicals are in that category. But it means that the evidence is maybe about, say, 50% approximately in studies that have been carried out, and it tends to occur at slightly higher doses. And possibles, in fact, are those that, while they cause cancer in animals, they only usually produce cancer in humans at higher concentrations. And alcohol forms is in that category. Ethanol is in that category. Long-term intake of high levels of ethanol, we classify alcohol as a group 2B carcinogen. Now that's not its major effect. It's mainly a narcotic, by the way, alcohol. And then I won't pay much attention to this because unclassified, they don't put anything in the WHO system, and they call it Group D in the United States. But an E or a 4 would indicate that they're very, very happy that the chemical is non-carcinogenic. So do remember, when you say something is causing cancer, it has to be qualified with either a Group 1, a 2A or a 2B, or in America an A, B1 and a B2, before in fact you can say. So I wouldn't worry so much about B2s or 2Bs, but certainly you get more worried when something is classified as a 2A or a B1, and certainly with a 1 or an A in the US system. So I hope that that has clarified a point on that for you. Now, how do we actually extrapolate from animals to humans, or even from cells to humans to some extent? We cannot simply transfer the data. You cannot conduct experiments on humans. But actually, sometimes we get exposed accidentally to chemicals in the workplace, or if there are accidents as an example. And that's how dioxin has been studied. But there's a term that I suppose I have put down no L here, no observed effect level. I had in the earlier slide a no AL, N-O-A-E-L, and no observed adverse effect level. But when you put down this one here, the no L, this includes good effects and bad effects. So you could take caffeine as an example. Caffeine from tea or coffee. Caffeine, some people say, good for you. Other people say, oh, you know, yes, it keeps me awake and driving to Dublin. Isn't that right? But, you know, higher concentrations can have negative effects on your blood pressure. Okay? So when you say Noel, it's not Christmas time, and I'm not being just funny about it. Noel is in fact an official term that's used for no observed effect level, and it refers to both good effects and bad effects. Combines the two. The earlier one I showed you below the Paracelsus Principle was the NOAD, that's the no observed adverse effects. It only looked at adverse effects. So this is more comprehensive. So in arriving at the acceptable daily intake, that's the dose that humans may be exposed to for their lifetime without incurring any adverse effect. The ADI is the dose or the amount of a chemical which a human can ingest daily over his or her lifetime without incurring any negative or toxic effects, or if you like, any disadvantageous health effects. The way it's calculated is by, if you have the NOEL from animal studies, you divide it by 2 powers of 10 for a non-carcinogen, and 3 powers of 10, that's 10 to the power of 3, for a actual, that's 1,000, for a molecule that's carcinogenic, i.e. causes some type of cancer. Now the factors are actually, if you take into account your age and the actual fact that you extrapolate from animals to humans, they assume that animals are 10 times less sensitive to chemicals than humans. So a factor of 10 is put in for that. And a factor of 10 is put in for young children or people over 70, as an example. In between, you don't get a factor for that. If it's carcinogenic, you get another one. But the important thing is that there's this term here, the acceptable daily intake, which I've abbreviated. Well, it's an official abbreviation, ADI, and that's the way you calculate the amount that a human can get from animal studies. It's not ordinarily made clear, and I had to gloss over, obviously, these factors here. They're called safety factors, these 10 by 10. I think they can be generally somewhat on the high side myself, so that's a conservative view for arriving at toxicity assessments. That's the way, in fact, the data were calculated for the pork crisis in 2008, as an example, and the data ultimately came through from the European Food Safety Authority, as an example. So, we've done some bit of toxicology first, and I hope you don't think I'm boring you on it, or anyway. I think it's important to understand these terms, and they're not ever presented that clearly. Now, we get down to the brass tacks. Chemicals themselves. Melamine, as you can see there, I've had to put in some text on these because I wanted to cover a reasonable number of chemicals and at the same time not bore you with long lists of chemicals. And if you look at melamine, now, I'm sure you don't mind me showing you the chemical structures, okay? But the way we write some of them, they're in ring formation, and we'll see later on others are straight lines. So these rings, this is a benzene ring type, not actually benzene ring, but it's of that shape. 6-membered ring. And the way it's drawn is that there's a carbon atom here, there's a nitrogen atom here, a carbon atom at this vertex here, a nitrogen here. We always have carbons. We don't put in the C symbol. Here's another carbon, and here's nitrogen. But look at all the nitrogens on the side. 1, 2, 3. So it's got 3 nitrogens in the ring, 3 nitrogens on the outside. 6 nitrogens in this molecule. Cyanuric acid on the right side is a metabolite. When it gets into your body, it gets converted to this as well. And it's a bit simpler of a molecule. Some of the side nitrogens have been removed. They would be excreted as ammonia. But this stuff was found in cat and dog food in the US in 2007. And it caused acute kidney failure because the 2 complexes together gave rise to kidney stones, as an example. They produce an insoluble complex. Melamine gives a false, you might say, why did they do this? It was also, by the way, put into baby food. And I think, we'll wait for the next slide, obviously. But it gives a false positive indication of the presence of protein. So what they were doing was passing off the melamine as protein. Protein is expensive, melamine is cheap. Okay? So it gave a false positive level when the analysis of protein was being carried out. So it's a money-making racket. What are the symptoms? It happened in, I don't want to blame China for everything, but it was added intentionally. It causes anorexia, vomiting, tiredness, and various urinary problems, and the crystals, I spelled crystals wrong obviously, crystals in the kidney tubules. So it's like getting calcium stones, as you would, or gout stones as an example, gout crystals in gout. So melamine, do you remember, it's used actually in making, isn't it, for in plastics and covering of, say, formica type things. Now, I don't want to keep you reading too much of this, but I'll just point out the main headings. Melamine was also found in baby food. And 2 faced execution for their roles, 2 men actually, senior members of the company that was producing the baby food, and they were actually executed. And the lady who was the chief executive was given 25 years jail sentence. But I just put in some of the stuff that I collected on this. 2 men are to be executed. They were actually, and I did have a cutting from the London Times in which actually the execution was carried out. But outside the court, parents they railed against the leniency of the sentence for the head of the company. The 2 lower downs got executed. It was the lady herself, the CEO, actually managed to hang on. Now, yeah, we won't make any analogies to the current crisis. We have ourselves. Penalty. The lady pleaded guilty, the CEO pleaded guilty to the charges of selling fake or substandard protein products. And that tells you, more or less, by way of summary, that sorry, I went too fast there. At the very bottom here, so-and-so was given death penalty for producing and selling toxic food. The second person received, the lady received a suspended death sentence, which is usually, and was commuted to 25 years, as an example. But really, when you think of what melamine is, it's not very toxic or anything like that, but quite clearly it was put into animal food, and then it was also put into baby food, as an example. Actually, when this was took place in China, there was a massive revulsion in China as well, because of this happened, and they started buying, of course, baby food from the West. And I think there was a difficulty in supplying enough baby food to China from the West. So it was advantageous in a way, trade-wise perhaps. So do remember melamine. You should be always on your guard. Now, diethylene glycol. I have the formula for anybody who's really interested in those things. Well, I've drawn it in 2 ways. But it's a longish molecule. It's got 2 ethylenes and a hydroxyl and an oxygen linking another one on the other side. So that's where the diethylene comes from. And a glycol is something that has 2 of these oxygenated or hydroxyl groups. So it's reasonably water soluble, and it resembles what molecule? Antifreeze. resembles that, but it's a thickening agent actually in toothpaste. In improperly produced toothpaste. Cheap toothpaste. Now I know there are lots of things in toothpaste that you can complain about, but by the way, I wouldn't be buying one with diethylene glycol, because of course it can give you kidney stones as well, and it can actually affect the nervous system, but I'm not sure that that is well classified. So that's been in the news in the past 2 to 3 years, diethylene glycol. Chromium, of great concern in Cork. The abbreviation for chromium elementally is CR. There are 3 forms of chromium that are important: the metal itself, and then these 2 charged molecules, chromium with 3 pluses and chromium with 6 pluses. And it's the chromium with the 6 pluses that's the dangerous one. It's actually a group 1 carcinogen, by the way. A group 1 carcinogen. It causes nasal carcinoma, amongst others. But, as I have pointed out here, it exists in 3 forms, but this is the dangerous form. I wouldn't worry about the others. It's put into steel, by the way, making stainless steel, of course. And then reprocessing of steel, that's where it is coming from. And the dump in Hallbolin, obviously, I'm not up to date clearly on, because we haven't been shown the inner sanctum, as it were, of the analyses that were carried out, but I do know the government is committed to getting rid of that dump by 2014, and it has provided 40 million to actually get rid of the dump. And clearly, people are worried. I know they have asked me. There may not be as many at the lecture tonight as there were on the first few nights, but the people over here are obviously very interested, and one gets frequent phone calls on these things, as I'm sure will vouch for that. These topics are often, we're often called on the phone. And as I've said there, chromium is emitted from steel processing plants and smelters. And the Hallbolin issue is an ongoing issue, and hopefully they will get rid of the stuff by 2014, and that we won't lose out in a second bailout or anything like that in financing the thing we did here. That's in fact, unfortunately, they're all with that, something like that. But chromium is a metal widely used, isn't it, in electroplating, and when you had the chromium strips on your car, as an example, that's where they come from. And just out of interest for ladies, females in the audience, chromium-6 in the form of a dichromate was the curing agent for leather in making the really expensive ladies' handbags. It's been banned for that purpose. But if you have a 40-year-old handbag from your grandmother, I don't think I'd throw it out, but I certainly wouldn't be bringing it to breakfast, because there's definitely chromium-6 in that. Mercury. I had to mention mercury, because thermometers have now been banned with mercury, as you know. Isn't that right? If you have a barometer with mercury, a mercury column in the house, whether it's an antique or whether it's a fairly modern one, but there's also the famous Fitzroy one that you tend to see in Ireland a bit, and they obviously have a mercury column, unlike the aneroid barometer. So there are 3 forms of mercury as well: the pure liquid metal, Hg, the hydrargium is the Latin, isn't that right, Latin? The Hgm1 plus and Hgm2 plus. This is known as mercurous mercury, and this is known as mercuric mercury. And it actually, in Japan, there was a massive scandal around in the 50s. It may seem a long time ago, but would you believe it? The effects have only receded in the last 5 to 10 years, as was reported in the medical journal The Lancet. But what actually happened in Japan was that this stuff was used as a catalyst in making plastics. It was mercuric sulfate. And it was excreted into the bay of this town, Minamata. I'm not sure which island in Japan it's on, but when it got into the bay, it fell to the bottom, it sank to the bottom, as it were, into the mud, and it got converted into what's known as dimethyl mercury, Hg, with 2 organic groups on the mercury, and it was this was the toxic molecule in the end. Now mercury itself, well, it's known sort of neurotoxin, but it's not a very powerful one or anything like that. But this stuff is really toxic, and it causes ataxia, neurological problems, and you you got very tired very quickly. You couldn't control the fine movements of your fingers, as an example, which is typical of what happens in ataxia, which is a phenomenon. It is neurological, of course. And you got convulsions and many other things from it in where they were exposed. Now, how were they exposed? By eating fish, of course. The fish picked up this stuff. It's very fat-soluble, this stuff, because of the methyl groups. And in fact, it entered the food chain by the fish and then to humans. So that's how people are poisoned. The worst case in Japan. Now, it may have occurred elsewhere, but not to the same extent in other parts of the world. But MINIMATA disease is, in fact, a sort of classic neurological disease caused by a chemical. Unfortunately, there have been no major ones, certainly in the last 20 years. I couldn't leave this on the side because all of us at some time eat tuna, isn't that right? Yeah. Well, according to this article from the Times, London Times, 6 slices a week could breach your health limits. So, if you get tuna from certain parts of the Pacific, where there's more mercury in the water and it tends to be accumulated by the tuna, then it might be wise to at least cut your intake. And but probably the better manufacturers of it in the West, one doesn't need to worry quite as much. But I just put this up because I saw it connected it from the Times, and it's a bit sensational in a way. At least mercury is not carcinogenic, but admittedly, were the organic mercury to be formed, I would worry about it. But there wouldn't be organic mercury in the tuna, by the way. It would be elemental type mercury. So you don't have to go off your tuna, but I wouldn't eat it too many times. Anyhow, who'd want to eat it 6 times a week? Dioxins. Many people, some people who know me, William included, and my wife was there, they say, oh, he never stops talking about dioxins. Well, I just measured them once, but anyhow, they're very difficult to measure. In the early days, or mass spectrometer was able to measure them at least to some extent. They're very difficult to measure, but dioxins, of course, are the products, as everybody, I think, in Cork and in Dublin, and in Galway too, where incineration has been proposed as a way of getting rid of waste. They worry about them. And they are actually chlorinated organic chemicals. But they came to notice, really, as they were present in the defoliant that was used in the Vietnam War around 1970. And in fact, American veterans who came back from the war were shown to have higher levels of dioxins. Okay, they were a contaminant, by the way, in the Agent Orange, which was made up of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, which were, of course, basically their weed killers, parasites. And they weren't supposed to be there, but the process was unfortunately generating them and they didn't fully appreciate it. And then there was a famous disaster where a plant that made pesticides blew up in Italy and sprayed the stuff all around, I think within about maybe 2 or 3 kilometres, maybe 5 kilometres of the plant as an example. Nobody ever died, but they did actually get a very severe dermatitis in that case. And there were several pollution incidents in the United States as well. The United States would have a lot of incinerators, as would France, as would Germany, and many other countries in Europe, including Great Britain. Now, the dioxin crisis. Well, we had heard of the Irish one, and I think we got singled out badly because, you know, it affected our agriculture quite a lot, and it cost the government €180 million to actually withdraw the products and compensate the farmers and compensate some supermarkets as well, as I understand. Because what actually happened in the Irish case, we see in the middle there, but there was actually a case in India. And very few people seem to have heard about it. But it was in this guar gum, and the guar gum is a water-soluble dietary fibre which comes from the seeds of the guar plant. It's a common additive in food products, including yogurt. Now, honestly, I'm not going to be eating yogurts where there are gums in them. That's my personal view. But remember, I'm only speaking personally. But I'm not saying they all come from there, but you need to be very careful of where the constituents come for certain consumer products, whether they're food or for your car or for some household cleaners or whatever. Dioxins, where did they come from, you say? Well, they appear to be present in this fungicide that was used for obviously killing fungi in the food and feed, as an example. It puzzled me, it must be an association in a way, but they still haven't fully resolved where the exposure. Pentachlorophenol is also used as a wood preservative, by the way, pentachlorophenol. The Irish one was actually due to an oil used in drying pig feed. And the pig feed got contaminated, and then of course the feed got into I forget the number of farms, but several farms in any case. And we know that food has to be, pig meat, pork has to be withdrawn for about 1 week before it could go back on the market again. Of course, they needn't have worried that much because the levels weren't that high. But on the other hand, if you only eat the lean part of the pork, it was fine. So all the dioxins go to the fat. So you could have put the fat away, and I could say to you, I give a very high guarantee that that was the correct interpretation. I did say it at the time, and I was criticised, but you know, we forget some of those things. You know, governments never admit they're wrong. The last one, I don't know if you heard about it. The German pork and egg contamination crisis of 2010-11. Very little said about it. I didn't hear Dr. Merkel talking about it. But the Germans did comment a lot about the Irish one. And even in the article I read, at the very bottom of one of the pages was a reference to the Irish one, which was 2 years earlier. Okay. The German one has been turned out to be worse than they initially said. Now, where did it come from? Well, it came from, well, at least the dioxins were present in some fat that was used in the animal feedstuff. And there were 14 farms affected in the North Rhine-Westphalia region. The eggs, some of them were exported to the Netherlands as well. I'm not sure where all the pork ended up, but none ended up in Ireland. Now, what for dioxins? Well, you might have seen this one, Time magazine. This was the former, I think, Prime Minister of the Ukraine, and he was poisoned by Moscow. I'll leave it at that. We won't identify anybody. And here was Yevtushenko, was his name. Here he was, July 4, 2004. And here he is with the characteristic poisoning symptoms of dioxin, i.e. a very severe ulcerative dermatitis, particularly of the face. Now, this was 6 months later approximately. I haven't seen him in recent times or photographs of him, but the main problem with dioxins at that level is he got a very high dose, is that in fact it is a liver, it causes cancer of the liver. It's a soft tissue cancer causing agent. Well, what type of chemical is it just? It's an organohalide. That means it has organic bits of molecules in it with carbon and hydrogen, and it also has, in fact, chlorine. And they're organochlorines. It has some similarity to DDT, but they're not as complex as I've already pointed out, or as toxic as was often claimed. They're extremely insoluble in water, but very soluble in fat solvents. And I've shown the structures next. That's an important point. So if you did take them in, they tend to go to your fatty tissue in your stomach or in the thorax and things like that. So if you remember back when we had the pork crisis, they told you dump all pork, isn't that right? And all your rashes and things like that. But actually all you need to do is cut away the fat and keep the lean. The ratio of dioxins in the fat to the lean was 6 million to 1. There was no reason in the world for throwing out your pork, in my opinion. And by the way, I was on the committee that was looking at this afterwards, and that is not in any way boastful. I disagreed with them, with any of them. Although it's likely when you disagree with them. But I had a chemical basis for doing it, not my opinion. Opinions are one thing, but facts are the important thing. Now, what does they look like? Since I know there are some people who are interested in the chemical formula too, I did say there were organohalogens. That is, these are benzene rings, and here's the chlorine on either side, and here's the chlorine on either side, and here are 2 oxygen atoms in the middle linking the 2 benzenes. That's the dioxin. This is another type of them here. We don't worry about it. It's very, very similar, just missing 1 oxygen here. And there are actually 75 forms of this, but the one I've shown you is the most toxic one. It's known as tetrachlorodibenzoedioxin. And that's the one that you worry about when in fact you're looking for them, where somebody to be exposed, or where they in fact be in foodstuff, or something like, or in soil as an example. They're extremely difficult to measure. The second lot of them, not quite as toxic, these ones, there are 135 forms are known as the tetrachlorodibenzofuran, by the way. Very difficult to analyze in the lab, by the way, very difficult. You do need equipment that runs to the order of approximately 1 million of each instrument. You have to have a specialist operator as well, not any old operator. So we said what dioxins are, organohalogens. They are soft tissue carcinogens, but they can also cause the more usual poisoning that you see is what was on Victor Yevtushenko's face. I don't think Moscow chose a very good poison, by the way. They should really, if they wanted to get rid of Yevtushenko, no, I know you accept that I'm joking, what should they have used? Well, I would guess tetrodotoxin, actually. that was the one that was second most toxic to Clostridium botulinum on our third or fourth slide. So the same applied to Litvinov, who was actually injected with polonium-210, that's radioactive, and he got 6,000-fold positive in all of those. And it's not a very good way to kill somebody, if that's what you want to do. Now, bisphenol A has been of interest as well. And just to point out what is phenol, we know that phenol is used as an antiseptic, isn't that right? Certainly in older things, and used to be present in Dettol and such preparations. But it has 2 benzene rings, and it has 2, these are bits of a water molecule, really. They're called hydroxyl groups. And they have 2 organic groups up here, methyls, and another carbon in here. So they're moderately complex molecules, but not complex compared with the dioxins you saw earlier. This is the last one. They have no chlorine, but they are used in making plastics, such as the semi-clear polycarbonate plastics, which are very resilient plastics, and they don't crack as easily or undergo crazing like plexiglass and things like that. Or I don't think they become brittle like polyethylene. They're also present in epoxy resins, and particularly they're present in baby bottles. They're also used as protective coatings in food cans. So food pea cans, beans and things like that. But I wouldn't worry about the amounts there. But the problem with babies, of course, is that they will be licking and sucking the bottles, and then you put milk into them, and the milk has fat in it, and it might tend to extract any residual bisphenol A that would be in the plastic. Now, bisphenol A is polymerized, of course, into the polycarbonate. So, like, they're not being exposed to the molecule directly. The whole of the molecules joined up to give you the plastic. But the EU have banned the use of it in baby bottles since last June, on the basis of being hazardous to children. It has largely, it affects the reproductive system, both of males and females, and reduces sperm counts too in males, as an example. So it's sort of as an endocrine disruptor type of molecule. So it's good the EU is keeping an eye on things, and we'll comment more on that in a moment. Acrylamide. Sorry for putting so many chemical formulae, but it's important to convey some idea of the complexity of the molecule as well. Acrylamide, I have the formula over here. There's a carbon here joined to an oxygen, and there's a double bond, 2 pairs of electrons in this joining up the oxygen. Here's another carbon, and there's another carbon at the end. So I didn't leave something out. This is often the way scientists represent these things. Perhaps I should have been more specific. And it has a nitrogen over here. So it's got carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen in it, acrylamide. It's used in laboratories and also in purifying water. But polyacrylamide is the normal form that you will see, in fact. So it's polymerized. This is the monomer, this is the single molecule, but it's joined up to a whole lot of them, and they cross-link it and things like that with a related molecule. And, but it has got considerable press recently because, believe it or not, it was discovered by Swedish scientists in 2002 to be present in toast. It's a neurotoxin, and it is carcinogenic. But it wasn't known to be present in toast as a purely fortuitous. I don't know how the Swedish scientists were working in it, but I did have somebody working in my lab, Dr. Virginia Salvari, actually, who worked in the lab in Sweden, in Gothenburg, I think William was in or Stockholm, one of them anyway. And they had a mass spectrometer, which is essential for measuring this acrylamide material. But as I've said here, it occurs at significant levels in some toasted, baked, and grilled, and I should have added fried, carbohydrate-rich foods. That's important, carbohydrate-rich foods. So they're looking at the moment to try and calcium tends to inhibit this process of formation of acrylamide. You know, but basically, don't burn your toast too much. If you do, then you're going to produce lots of acrylamide. I was going to bring a few things along tonight, but I didn't have time to toast the toast to the right level of light brownness that you're supposed to. I'm not being facetious in this at all, in order to avoid or minimize the amount of acrylamide formed. Acrylamide is a very dangerous molecule. I don't know about anybody in the audience, but it is used, by the way, for separating out DNA in the labs, by the way, but only as the polymerized form and for proteins. This is a further example of a hazard, I said, that has always been there, in my opinion, because let's face it, we've all been eating toast for a long time. No, it's something I wouldn't eat every day or anything like that myself on occasions, but maybe some people like to have it in the morning by the above process, but it has remained undetected and unsuspected until the Swedish detected it in 2002. I didn't hear many warnings coming from the Health Research Board at the end, by the way, or from the Minister for Health, or the Ministers for Health, for that matter. And the reason for me putting up this is not to have a jazzy-looking slide, but of course this is a slide that depicts the structure of our genes. This is DNA, and there are two strands in DNA. This is one, the red one, and the other is a blue one, and they're cross-linked here. They're joined up across to keep them stable, and they complement one another. But the last molecule, acrylamide, is actually a carcinogen, and it's genotoxic. It actually combines and damages your DNA, by the way. Now, there are repair enzymes that can repair it to a certain extent, but we don't know to what extent that is true at the present time. So I just thought it's useful to see do we know what these things are? We do. But can we stop them? Answer is not at the moment. We don't have an antidote. Sudan 3, I won't say much about this one, but it looks a fairly complex molecule. Look at all the rings. Nitrogens joined, these are known as azo centers. If you see azo on a tin of something, it means it has these nitrogen groupings in it. They're generally not very nice. These dyes actually were present in curries about 5 years ago. You might remember Sudan 1, 2, and 3. I only given you 3. They're brown, and so they were put into imported curry meals, and they are possibly carcinogens. The curry products were withdrawn at all the major sale outlets by Tesco, Donald's, and Sainsbury's, and others in England as well. So, you know, just watch out where you get your curries from if you want pre-cooked dinners. I haven't gone too far ahead, no? It's formaldehyde. Formaldehyde. I know my colleague will introduce you, isn't he? Formaldehyde in electron microscopy.
Oh yeah.
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 You're still around.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's actually a carcinogen. Respiratory tract. A very simple molecule. I have it on the next slide. Formaldehyde is a colorless gas at room temperature. It is a stinking, suffocating smell, actually. It's present in a wide array of products and resins, which acts in adhesives, say in chipboard and plywood and other related high-density fiberboards. It certainly is used in the Cork area where the resins are made, to my knowledge. Urea formaldehyde is in a resin that's made in a plant in Cork. And, of course, it is used by pathologists and anatomists and zoologists for fixing tissue prior to looking at them in the microscope, or the light microscope. And undertakers will obviously be exposed to it. And hair saloons is a well-known, in fact, irritant, both of the respiratory system and of the eye. And you'll see the formula on the next one. It's a very simple molecule. It's present in nettles to some extent. Not a lot, but formic acid is the main one. But believe it or not, we actually make some in the body as well. We make some formaldehyde, tiny amounts. So you often wonder about how dangerous these molecules are, in the whole body. But
It has recently been classified as a carcinogen by the United States National Toxicology Program. Unacceptable levels actually were found in some hair smoothing and straightening media, as an example. It's often present in the aerosol type things to keep your hair in place or to puff them up or whatever it is. Okay. Formaldehyde. I have great respect for formaldehyde because of the reactivity of it. It is we had the formula, so we're okay. Styrene is a related one, but it is not near as toxic, which you'll hear a lot about it, and I don't know why. But styrene, I put it in a box. It's got a benzene ring that's attached to 2 little carbon. This is a vinyl group here. It's really vinyl benzene. But anyhow, it's a benzene type molecule. Benzene, wherever you see it, you always worry about it, by the way. And styrene is used in boat fixing and boats, plastic, well, non-wooden boats anyhow. Non-metal ones, obviously, in baths and certain car parts, in shower cubicles, and in plastic cups and plates. But fortunately, it's polymerized in those cases, and you get polystyrene, so you get long chains built up, and it forms a clear monomer, a clear plastic, when you heat it to about 200 degrees centigrade. I forgot to put the note up. And it has excellent insulation properties. But in general, I've been where styrene has been used, and certainly it had a very irritating effect on the eye. And I can easily imagine if you were using the ordinary styrene that you would actually easily get a headache and feel tired and become unsteady and perhaps have certain semi-narcotic effects. But I just looked it up in detail. Evidence on the American Cancer Society indicates that the level in consumer products are low of what's called the monomer, the single molecule. But once it's polymerized, it seems to be relatively safe, or at least the risks are low because the concentrations that are present are low, as an example. And the American Cancer Society is a very reliable scientific body, actually, so I would believe easily what they were saying. Now, this is a change of tack in a way, because I'm back to foods at last. I don't know, have you actually heard about trans fats, anybody? Yeah? If you go into the supermarket, do you look, sir, for, is it present in the, well, usually spreads for, i.e. imitation butter. I looked at them recently. Only one major supplier had identification of trans fats in the product. Now, they actually gave the level that was in, which was less than 0.5 grams per 100 grams, to my recollection, which would be 0.5% on a weight-for-weight basis. Trans fats, by the way, are illustrated here. A trans fat is one which has these straight type of fatty acids. Fatty acids being the sort of fat part of a saturated fat. Now, this molecule over here is known as oleic acid, and this is what you would get in olive oil as an example. And it has a double bond in the middle. You can see it there. If I can steady up the pointer. Between this is the carbon and this is the carbon, and this is a double bond. And this fatty acid is quite mobile, and it moves around quite a bit and flips and forth, back and forth. It's said to be have a lot of liquid properties. That's very important in cell membranes for fluidity of the membranes, keeping them mobile and supple. But this one over here is a bit like a fiber. It's more like a saturated fatty acid, because it's got the hydrogens on the wrong side of the bond here. They're on the same side here, the yellows. That's what a trans fat, they're opposite to one another here. But by the way, they can actually occur between, it's got 1, 2, 3, between this carbon 4 and carbon 12 up around here as well. These are the trans fats. Now, they definitely, I've summarized the properties over here. Trans fats are fatty acid, okay. This one is not olive oil, it's the, or oleic acid one. It's known as elidaic acid, just because it has different hydrogens between carbon 9 and carbon 10. This is normally carbon 9 and carbon 10. The trans fats themselves have rigid structures, and they resemble saturated fats, and that's what you don't want present, well, except to a minor extent, in the fat that we ingest in our food. And there is good evidence indicating that such fats increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, in other words, some type of heart disease. or restriction of blood flow due to cholesterol accumulation as well. So we have raised, this is a raised form of bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and there's an increased ratio of total cholesterol to the good cholesterol, which is that's a very good indicator of cardiovascular disturbance, and it increases the saturated fats in blood as well, that swim around in the blood as an example. And the last thing I read, and this is very recent, they promote systemic inflammation. That's around the body. In various tissues, they can promote inflammation. They do so by stimulating a thing known as TNF, tumor necrosis factor, but don't worry about it. That is pretty new, actually. The other things were known for a while. What amazes me is that there isn't a compulsory requirement to state the amount of trans fats in various butter spreads, or butter imitation spreads I call them for want of some other description, barring one major manufacturer. Now, they are present, by the way, in admittedly hydrogenated vegetable oil. So you should be looking for at least a statement that there's no hydrogenated vegetable oil in the food, as an example. Because hydrogenated vegetable oils are the ones that have these funny bonding, these funny bonds. Okay? So that's the minimum that should be on the package. No hydrogenated vegetable oils. But they should also state the amount of the trans fats. They're very bad for you from a cardiovascular standpoint. I just thought I'd put cholesterol up because it looks a nice molecule. You might say I like drawing molecules. Well, I have a program for drawing it. It eventually works, and my computer isn't sort of stuffed with something else, as it were, because it takes up an awful lot of memory to actually make things. Yeah. But cholesterol is worth describing. It's a long, fatty molecule, this long bit here. It has a couple of rings in it too that you cannot see because the other atoms sticking out of the rings are occluding them, but they're here, look. There's one there, there's one there, and there's one there. And cholesterol is very water insoluble, but it has one OH group on the end, and this is the one that sort of sticks into the water when it's in your blood, as an example. But because the molecule is really, the rest of it is all fatty material, fatty carbon and hydrogen, it only dissolves very, very poorly. And that's why, of course, you can get precipitation in the aortic, in the vessels supplying the heart, as an example. It does cause heart disease. You get coronary occlusion because obviously it deposits in the vessels and reduces the diameter of the flow of the vessel for blood flow, as an example. And we said on the last slide, in fact, and look, where do you get it from? Well, I wouldn't like to blame the hamburger for everything, because all the companies have been putting salads in it nowadays. But nevertheless, we do need to watch our diet in relation, speaking for myself, you always need to watch on these things, because it is too easy to eat them. And I know if I was driving somewhere and you're really stuck and you get them, you still felt you haven't eaten anything, so you would like more. So they seem to be autocatalytic in generating, shall we say, your yen for them. Now, at this stage you might say to me, are there any good chemicals at all? Because I've only described a small number and I could have gone on and on. Well, you can see my answer. There are, but you must remember, there are plenty, but the key thing to remember is the old Paracelsus Principle again, that all substances are poisons. There is none that is not a poison. The right dose depends if it's a poison from a remedy. Isn't that the answer to it, really? So you have to be careful the way you use toxic as well. For instance, the paper that I referred to where they talked about toxic sugar. Well, look, we need some sugar. The brain needs 120 grams of glucose per day, or it ain't going to work. I mean, that's a biochemical fact. 120 grams is approximately 4 ounces. So you can't do without some sugar. But the point is, once you exceed the proper dose, as Paracelsus saw long ago in the Renaissance times, once you go beyond the right dose, you end up with a poison. You can say toxic if you like. Parabens. They are good chemicals in my opinion, depending how you look at it. They were thought to be linked to breast cancer, by the way, but there is good evidence that, in fact, that is incorrect. And what are parabens? Well, the heading that I had from one paper thing that was written was underarm hygiene at risk if parabens are shown to be toxic, because of course they're present in deodorants and antiperspirants, as well as in fake tan and God knows what else. And that was the reason I was going to bring the fake tan bottle along tonight. I don't know why I bought it, but I had a bottle at home. And the molecule, by the way, it's the full name is, it looks like that bulb is going to blow, para-hydroxybenzoic acid, and it has the R here. There's no element called R, but it stands for a methyl group or an ethyl group, like in ethanol as an example. So that's why they're called, they've given that name parabens. They're para, and I've given the full name okay there, as far as I know, yeah, I have. They're alkyl esters of para-hydroxybenzoic acid. So this is the benzoic acid part here, and this is the alkyl bit. Now, sodium benzoate is used as a food preservative. So I always thought it was unlikely these were dangerous chemicals, but it's not my area of work, since anaesthetics and air pollution to be mine. But they have been, as I have summarized for you there, some 59 papers were examined by this chap at the University of Nice in France, looking into the possible toxicity of parabens, and he concluded that there was no public health risk and no likelihood of breast cancer, obviously in women, and people shouldn't be worried. At the same time, one should not overuse any of these things. I often say, it's not the use of chemicals that's the problem, it's the misuse of chemicals that's the problem. And we saw that with antibiotics long ago. Penicillin was discovered by Sir Alexander Fleming, but it didn't get on the market until after the Second World War, because they couldn't isolate it in a pure form until Ernest Chain, the biochemist, succeeded in a new technique in getting it. Okay? Oh, and after the World War, what did the farmers do? They used it for mastitis. They couldn't get enough of it. They should have used it properly, and we wouldn't have the resistance to antibiotics that we have today. Now, antioxidants, so parabens, okay, they're fine, but look, use them with caution, of course. And obey Paracelsus' rule. Antioxidants are chemicals which prevent oxidation, i.e. oxygen catalyzed reactions causing damage in the body. And many of you will be familiar with them because they're frequently in the papers at the moment. It is estimated, as I say, that a third of all cancer deaths are attributed to dietary factors. And these components, the antioxidants, do protect against cancer and other things as well. But the best known ones are the polyphenols, the stanols. They are present in, say, those, what do you call it, the Finnish preparation. And nobody knows about it. Benical, yeah. 7% stanol in it. Yep. 2 slices a day is all you need for bread with it, by the way. And they are very carotenoids from carrots, say, as an example. Flavonoids come from some vegetables as well. So eating a wide range of vegetables is going to provide you with these. And of course, you get the various other antioxidants in tea, particularly green tea, as an example. But tea in general is good in relation to antioxidants. And basically, they prevent what are known as reactive oxygen species, damaging your DNA and your proteins and things like that. Now, there is some doubt about the effectiveness of them. Do the blood concentrations get up to the right levels that have been shown in the labs as an example when they have been worked on? So antioxidants present in tea, red wine, and many vegetables and fruits can counteract potential adverse effects. We're not sure of the magnitude of the effect, but there is some good evidence, certainly with tissue culture studies, that that is so. So here, there are two chemicals, there are a big group of chemicals as well, the antioxidants. Now, do be careful that where you to say, oh yeah, well, somebody told me that red wine has a load of antioxidants, oh, I'm going to polish up a bottle of red wine tonight. No, that's not the right way to do it. You still have to obey the rule that you're not supposed to drink more than the equivalent for males of 2 units of alcohol, right? Or 1 unit per day for females. It's not right. So I'm always saying, nothing drinking bottles of wine when you go home. No, but seriously, people do misinterpret this. Students in particular think that, oh yeah, sure, I can study during the week and drink my 14 half pints on Saturday. That's wrong as well. I'm an alcoholic. Natural chemicals, they're supposed to be good for you, by the way, in general. But by the way, it's not always true. The risks from synthetic chemicals can be compared with natural chemicals. For instance, if you take broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower, some of the young plants in particular, they contain anti-cancer agents, okay, such as STYRENE, but actually some species contain another chemical called indole 3-carbinol, and that actually causes cancer. So you often wonder yourself, to what extent, in fact, are you eating broccoli for at all? But of course, it's the ratio of the two that's important. So, let's put it this way. I hope I missed. Yeah, I thought I had something else on this one. How worried should we be? It depends, really. Now, in relation to what I'm saying, you'd say, is there any good chemical around on the basis of what I've said so far? And we have given some answers, yes, and you have to be careful in relation to what the dose is as an example. But how worried should we be? Well, one put this obviously on with tongue-in-cheek. It depends on the degree of risk which we're willing to live with. And as I said, in science and medicine and technology, well, while they make life more healthy and more pleasant and apparently safer, they also have, in fact, risk associated with them. But we have become accustomed to tolerating a certain level of risk, isn't that correct? And the usual way that I put that is that when I'm driving to Dublin, actually, it's a greater risk than actually eating lots of consumer products, or being, shall we say, in contact or exposed to them as well. You have a 1 in 5,000 risk of being killed on the way between Dublin and Cork. Pretty high risk. The main problem, I think, is that if we get too worried about things, we become so risk averse that, in fact, we stay in bed all the time. But the trouble with staying in bed all the time, as you'll see on another slide in a moment, is that, of course, we'll get other problems. Yes. Now, I said I'd mention REACH to you, because REACH refers to, it's an acronym for the Regulation, Evaluation, Authorization and Restriction of Chemicals, and it came into force in June 2007. But basically, it's a European system that was set up to regulate the testing and the authorization for selling chemicals on the market, basically, to cut a long story short. And one doesn't hear that much about it, but they are moving ahead quite a bit. And the member governments of the EU, there's a committee on which at least one member from each member state sits, as an example, and then they have 2 or 3 subcommittees that then look into chemicals. And you can actually make representations to the European Chemicals Agency, the ECHA, by the way, and say, well, I'm very worried about this chemical, and you write to them in Brussels and say, I want this investigated, or can you let me have more information on it? Okay. So REACH stands for, as I've said, the words, in fact, that are on the first 2 lines there. And up to that, the legislation within the EU for controlling chemicals, it could be said, was haphazard. And nothing's bad, but certainly it was missing out a lot of things. I think they expect to look at some 30,000 chemicals by 2014 as an example. So they initially wanted to look at some 70,000 chemicals, but industry didn't like that, you know. Industry never does. But they have to tolerate that safety, and it's a very important thing too. Now, since I've been given a watch there to move on, I just said we leave out the other because it was only saying more, that's what I added, was, is there such a thing as safe as well? You see, if you have a program for evaluating chemicals, well, you're going to obviously have to deal with the issue of safe. And there's no such thing as absolute safety, and that's why I put they put it in here, in parentheses, or vertical. Is genetic engineering safe? Is the new drug for my arthritis, is it safe? Paracetamol, is it safe? That's the painkiller. Nuclear power stations, are they safe? Dioxins at low levels are safe, according to a recent article in a major newspaper. You know, well, it depends on what you mean by safety, and fundamentally, safe is not an absolute term at all. It's a relative term. And all we can say is that chemicals and other entities which cause no harm or injury are deemed to be safe. But of course, we have to put some probability on that, and that's why we say safeness, or to put it another way, the likelihood of a chemical being safe. you estimate what the risk is of, in fact, contracting some adverse effect from exposure to given concentrations or doses of a chemical, as an example. So, in the last one there, science can give the level of risk that a chemical will cause harm at, but it cannot prove that a chemical will be harmless under all conditions. That's very important. It cannot prove that a chemical will be harmless under all conditions. Obviously, that is also derivable from Paracelsus Principle, in fact, too. And I have this one here. The meaning of safe then continues, but we won't say much more about it. We cannot be absolutely safe, but consider the following. Do not swim and avoid the risk of drowning. Do not cycle and avoid the risk of being, etc. Do not drive. You certainly won't get to Dublin. But stay at home, avoid all risk. It's not possible. What about inactivity, bed sores, accidents on the stairs and things like that? Fundamentally, you cannot avoid risk. So the last one that I'll put up on this one is, there is no government policy on the acceptability of risk. There is no government policy on the acceptability of risk. And there's little point in us, if REACH does not actually define acceptable levels of risk, I don't see how it can actually really improve our perception of whether a chemical is safe to eat or to have in your clothing or to use as a pesticide or to be present in some part of your car or in your carpets or various items of furniture, as an example. Okay? And is zero risk meaningless? The national authorities should really set up risk levels, but the WHO have actually made suggestions that the level of risk which countries might adopt would be 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million, actually. The guideline concentrations actually for carcinogenic chemicals corresponding to these levels actually are used, by the way, in the air policy guidelines for Europe, which is actually run by the WHO. So if something only occurs, say, 1 in 10,000 people in a lifetime, that would be, in my opinion, that would be a low risk. 1 in 100,000 would be lower, and 1 in a million would be highly desirable, but in practice, not achievable. So can I just summarize for you that while I have dealt with a lot of chemicals, maybe bored you with some formulae, but while lots of chemicals are dangerous, they're not that dangerous when you put them in the context of what Paracelsus said, that is the dose that matters. And I would advise when one does look at the adjective toxic, always related back to Paracelsus. So if you're below the Noel or the Noel, then you'll feel quite happy. Now there aren't very big lists of Noels and Noels available at the moment, but I'm sure that the REACH program will do so. Thank you very much for listening to me. I went on a bit long, but I had the advantage that there was nobody coming into the theatre afterwards. So thanks for listening to me.